UNC. I'd like to welcome everyone to the final lecture for this year's Writers Discussion Series, featuring book readings and discussions with UNC faculty as well as authors from across the nation. The series is co-hosted by the Stone Center and the Bull's Head Bookshop. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Tiffany Willoughby-Herard as our guest author. Tiffany Willoughby-Herard is an associate professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Among her many research interests are South Africa, poor whites, race and foreign policy, diaspora, comparative racial politics, Black political thought, third world feminisms, and feminist pedagogy. Many of these research streams come together in Waste of a White Skin, the Carnegie Corporation, and the Racial Logic of White Vulnerability, published by the University of California Press. Waste of White Skin is a study of the international dimensions of racialization of the poor in South Africa and demonstrates the ways in which U.S. elites supported apartheid and Afrikaner nationalism in the critical period before 1948. While much of the scholarship on whiteness in South Africa overlooks the complex politics of white poverty and their implications for Black political action, among other things, this book uses key paradigms in Black political thought to provide a rich account of poverty and work. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tiffany Willoughby-Herard.
Thank you all so much for being here. Can you hear? Is this fine? The volume's okay? I also want to thank the Bull's Head Bookshop and the Stone Center and my colleague, Dr. Joseph Jordan and Dr. Kia Lily Caldwell and Dr. May Henderson and the new colleagues that I've just met as well, and Sharif Drame, for making sure that this was an easy visit and setting everything up for me. I really, really appreciate it. When you write a first book, it's really kind of an adventure, and a scholarly book and a kind of deeply historical book like this one. Just the opportunity to be able to share with people is really a profound honor. And so thank you all for taking time to do that. And I understand from your professor here that many of you have studied global whiteness in the past in classwork, and so it's wonderful to be able to speak to an audience that's kind of informed about the theoretical work that's being done in this book. Okay, so I'm going to start with kind of a quick description of a couple of the conceptual frameworks and paradigms that drive it, and then I'm going to just actually read from the book. So I'm going to move from here to there. Okay. All right. So this book is about poor whites in South Africa, and it's important probably for you all to know how it was that I came to be writing about that population, that set of communities in that part of the world. So I'm from Detroit. I was raised there, and in Detroit, Michigan was one of the parts of the country where South African dissidents, anti-apartheid activists were able to go. That was largely because of the work of a man named G. Minnan Williams, who was a governor in the 70s and 80s, very influential person. And Williams was kind of a lay anthropologist, and so he would go around and talk to people about Africa. He was really compelled by decolonization. You know, he spoke to Congress people and other national leaders. He was kind of like a thought leader of his time. He said, you know, we have to really pay attention to what's happening in Africa. And the main way that he thought that in his role as governor he could provide support for these decolonizing countries was to actually recruit students from the African continent. So campuses like Kalamazoo, Michigan State, University of Michigan had really large, substantial numbers of South African students from the 70s on. So I grew up in a church with one of these South African dissidents, a very, very large, not a mega church, but a large activist, liberation, theology-oriented church. And the liturgist, which those of you who participate in any kind of religious circles, the person who is the liturgist, their job is to kind of set what the curriculum is, the teaching part, not the preaching part, the teaching part of a religious setting. And so I heard about South Africa as a child every Sunday. I knew more about South Africa and the anti-apartheid struggle than I knew about the rest of the United States, because our church had committed to support for the anti-apartheid movement, and they really wanted us to understand ourselves as internationalists and being really deeply devoted to and committed to that struggle. And in many ways, the kinds of marches that I participated in as a very young person around, you know, bias against car insurance prices and housing insurance prices, the kinds of things that more people are talking about now because they know about the issues of water quality and discrimination in Flint and Detroit. Those were things that were happening way back in the late 70s and the early 80s and 90s. We would march about those things as well as march about apartheid. And apartheid was really important for us because it helped us understand that the civil rights wins that our parents and our grandparents had really struggled for had not been achieved, either in the United States or in South Africa. So that's how I ended up there. I went, having come from Detroit, which is a union town, right? A lot of working people, working class people. I went thinking that I was gonna write a book about how it was that Black people had organized as workers from the 1920s to the 1970s, when it actually had been made a crime to participate in a union for Black people after the industrial unions, Black unions of the 1920s had been outlawed. So they couldn't actually participate in unions. Of course they were in, in co-ed unions, but it was illegal to be a member of a union up until 1979. So I'm in the archives, and I think that I'm gonna be writing about this experience of Black people in union life. And then I discovered this thing called the Inspectorate of White Labor. Now, for those of you who have ever done archival research, you think you're discovering a thing. The archivists really are in charge. Librarians really are in charge. What they hand you is what you actually have access to. You're digging, you thinking you're, and I appreciate so much the indexing that went into me being able to have access to this organization. So what was the Inspectorate of White Labor, and why was that in the files on Black workers? The Inspectorate of White Labor was a government organization, government agency that was set up to try to compel people who owned businesses to hire poor white workers. Because in the 1870s and 1880s, poor whites in rural South Africa were beginning to move to the cities, right? There had been a major boom with the discovery of gold and diamonds. And so these people who had, for the most part, been wagon riders, transport riders, that basically means somebody who trucks things that are grown in rural areas. They go and they collect it and they truck it into the cities, or they move it around the country to people who want to buy it. Or people who had been in sharecroppers, right, and tenant farmers, poor whites, were all moving to the urban areas. They were coming to the urban areas really, though, as a second industrial shift, right? They came to the urban areas after Black, colored, and Indian and Chinese workers had been moved to the urban areas where there's intensive both diamond but also agricultural work that's happening in an intensive kind of way, not just kind of the small holdings in rural areas. So they come to the cities and they can't find jobs. They are not used to city living. They're not people who are used to watches and having to be at jobs at a certain point in time. They're really, really, really rural. So the government is trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this population? And because we have such a huge population of Black people who've already been industrialized, moved to the proletarian experience a generation before them, how are we going to handle this poor white population? So they come up with this agency that literally is government officials who go around to people who make jams and jellies, all different kinds of businesses, really secondary, tertiary industries, and say, will you hire poor whites? And you think, well, these are our, kin, and we want to have a charitable sentiment towards them. We'll want to hire them. That's not actually what happens. It's not actually what happens. And so that, when I started to realize how much pushback there was from small business owners in South Africa against poor whites, I realized that I'd stumbled upon a kind of historical puzzle about how was it in a society that was really trying to consolidate white supremacy, that in fact poor whites were not valued really at all. They were not wanted by their quote-unquote racial kin. And I found numerous letters authored by small business owners in the urban areas who said things like, why would I ever hire a poor white who can only speak one language and still kind of has the corn under their fingernails, when I can hire a migrant black worker who speaks 4 or 5 languages and is used to living in the city and is really accomplished. And so this, opened up a lot of different kinds of questions. But the primary existing historiography in South Africa at the time didn't really allow me to answer those questions, because the account in South Africa was that Afrikaner nationalism, or the political ideology that was taken up in 1948 that really advanced apartheid and the separation of races, the historians who were trying to write about what had happened to poor whites and what had happened in the white class structure, they largely said that, poor whites were incorporated, they were protected, they were cared for, and apartheid was a set of policies that were put in place as a kind of social welfare to lift them up. And that's not what I found in the archives. I found, in fact, there was an incredible amount of struggle over whether or not poor whites would be viewed as proper citizens, whether or not poor whites would be viewed as people who could be potential laborers, whether or not poor whites would be viewed as even, now listen, this is really important, the racial kin of wealthy whites, both British and Afrikaner. Most of the histories, do you have a question? No? Okay, all right. Feel free to, if you have a question, feel free to stop me. Most of the histories of South Africa, even today, the way that they talk about South African history and how social transformation has moved forward, they talk about the Anglo-Boer War and the fight between the British and the Afrikaners, right? So the Afrikaners being the Dutch descent folks. Very few histories actually talk about the fact that the quote-unquote Afrikaners also include the so-called colored population, also include many people in the African population, as well as people who were British and English, as well as French and Jewish and many other, racial and ethnic identities. And so this fact is a really, really important one, because if the way that you tell the history of South Africa is about a struggle between North and South, to use the kind of language that we use here in the United States, right? Or, racial brothers at odds with each other that are able to reconcile, you don't really capture the fact that internationally there was an investment in global whiteness. And internationally, there was an investment in white nationalism, right? Not just in Southern Africa, but all over the Americas. The belief was the way that you can establish a nation state, particularly one that's been established in a settler kind of history, right, is that you needed to have enough white citizens and establish white minority rule, and there wasn't as much concern as we think today about the tensions around European ethnicity. In my book, something I do that's really distinctive is I try to minimize the account of ethnicity and instead raise the account of race. And not the way you're thinking. Not the account of race that talks about white versus black, but the account of race that talks about the way that British and Afrikaner identities really work together to solidify and consolidate white nationalism in that society. So how do I do that? There's a couple of important genealogies I'll share with you. The first is critical black thinkers in whiteness studies. So you all, many of you have studied quite a bit about global whiteness, and so I'm hoping that you'll know the names of people like Toni Morrison and Nell Irvin Painter, Cheryl Harris, and so many others, who all, as black scholars, have spent a lot of time writing about whiteness, right? That's an important genealogy, not just to place somebody who's embodied the way that I am, but also because it just really captures how the making of whiteness also produces blackness and black gendered identities, right? It has implications for these other communities. Another genealogy that's really important in the work is notions of South African history and what kind of history of South Africa gets told. So most of the literature in South African history has been largely understood as being in the realm of African studies, and it's not often enough read in African American and African diaspora studies, U.S. ethnic studies, or political science. If you were to quickly do a scan of political science departments, for example, in North America, you find that there's hardly any scholars of race and ethnic politics in the departments, just nationally. It's not that the people don't exist, they're just not in most of the political science departments. They end up in other places, but they are very highly concentrated in the HBCUs. So I wanted to kind of make that type of intervention with this book, talk about the ways that South African history could be read differently by people in African American studies. Another genealogy that was very important to me was race and the politics of knowledge. And so what I try to do is extend the discussion of the making of U.S. domestic racial politics by locating the politics of knowledge in its transnational scope. So rather than us making knowledge about any kind of field of inquiry only in one space, I talk about global whiteness, really of great intentionality. And in my field, political science, typically what we would do to write a project like this would be a comparative racial politics kind of thing, where you would look at racial politics in either one country and you would compare, time X versus time Y, right? You would look at 1920 versus 1930, right? Or you would look at two countries and compare their racial politics. What my book does is turn that framework on its head and starts with this idea that there's actually global whiteness that helps produce the nation state. The nation state is able to cohere because of a global infrastructure of whiteness. And the ways that I track that idea, and this is kind of my last set of comments before I start reading, the way that I track that is the investments in white nationalism and also in segregationist philanthropy. So you all, when you think of philanthropies, you probably think of the Gates Foundation or some other. What philanthropies do you think of? Anybody? Clinton Foundation, right? Ford Foundation, right? Philanthropies are really important, the same way media and political parties and the judiciary, they're very important in shaping politics. So what do we do in the world of the colonial era from the 1880s to 1920s when we realize that philanthropies are not just interested in doing reform work in their own country, but they're actually influencing policies around the world, right? So when we think about the Gates Foundation and their role in East Africa and the kind of really land displacement that's happening with that particular foundation, that's not a new formation. That's actually very, very old. It's at least 150 years old. Foundations in that time period largely emerge as a result of, quite similar to our own, but in a different kind of way. They really emerge from folks who have a large corporate entity and are trying to influence policy and to govern even though they don't have an elected office. So that way they're not really accountable to anyone, right? They're trying to, what I call, influence harvest. They're looking for places to build influence. Where are places that are going to be important? How can we use some kind of soft governance, right? Okay, so the last genealogy that I'll talk about that really shapes this project is Black feminist methodologies. And the reason why Black feminism was really important for me and distinctive from that kind of critical Black thinkers and whiteness studies is because Black feminism, when I began doing my research in the 90s, had an enormous amount to say about the racialization of poverty in the US. Because it was happening right during the 1994 through 96 debates around the Clinton Welfare Reform Act, and the notion that poor people were poor because of something about themselves, as opposed to something about the structure that was, that they lived in, or anything about policies that shaped their experience, or things they had access to versus things they didn't have access to. So once I had learned about that inspectorate of white labor, and I realized there was quite a bit of contention about how poor whites were going to be involved in South African society and what kind of role they were going to be allowed to play in the economy, I found something called the Poor White Study. The Poor White Study was and I can go off the screen. It was a 5-volume study produced by the Carnegie Foundation that was some of the best interdisciplinary research we can think of today. It was completely interdisciplinary. There were sociologists and economists and social workers and medical doctors who were part of going around the country of South Africa and actually interviewing poor whites and trying to figure out what their needs were, what their political affiliations were. That's a really important thing they were trying to figure out. Who they were loyal to, how they felt about living in these quote-unquote slums with Black and colored and Indian communities. What were their social identities, right? And so that seems like an interesting kind of study. Oh, that's great. Carnegie, as a foundation and a philanthropy, was concerned about this, impoverished community and wanted to figure out how to help. They published a 5-volume study that was incredibly influential in South Africa's apartheid policy after 1948. Almost every single one of those researchers who was part of the Poor White Study went on to run one of the government offices that instituted apartheid, right? So the person who was the educationist ran quote-unquote Bantu education, right? The Bush education or Black education for the next 60 years in South Africa, as well as ran 2 or 3 universities. And that should raise a couple of questions about how participating in one research study could kind of feed you into government position. But more important than that, what I found in reading the 5-volume study, which was widely circulated around the world, was their descriptions of poor whites were really racialized. They were profoundly racialized. So the social worker, who was a woman, Marie Elizabeth Rothman, I'll read a little bit of section from that chapter. She did the most hours, clocked the most hours of interviews. And a lot of her questions for people were things like, aren't you ashamed to have an Indian husband? And don't you feel bad? I mean, these are literally the questions that she asks people. Like, don't you think it's terrible that you and your wife and your husband live in a shack in the back house of this Black family? None of her questions actually reflect the social structures that compelled the experience that poor whites were having. In fact, they just mystified that and tried to shame poor whites into identifying with whiteness. And so in some ways, her interviews are really powerful for reflecting how poor whites were made into a political football for Afrikaner nationalist movements, and that it was their whiteness that was at stake, not their Afrikanerness. It was their whiteness that was at stake. All right, so I'm gonna start a little bit. So this is the cover of this book. I'm going to hold it up because I'm going to refer to it just a little bit. Dean Hutton's image, this image you see here, is kind of an impoverished encampment, a poor white encampment, contemporary right now. The poverty of being unwanted, Danville, which is a small suburb of Johannesburg, draws attention to the political uses of white identity and the possessions and kinds of spaces that typically signal white privilege. Yet the title and the caption refer meaningfully to Mother Teresa and the gap between privilege and misery. The possessions in question are a tent, a cloth-covered recliner, and a dog. Furnishings, belongings, and kin relations, whether with animate or inanimate things, have a particular resonance with racial regimes because of the ways in which they signify ownership, authority, and the realization of self-fashioning. These creature comforts also signify the ability to shelter under the protection of national citizenship through companionship and belonging. Part of the photographic series I Have Fallen, photographs of South Africa's poor whites from 2013, from which the cover image is taken, this series highlights individuals, families, and communities with captions explaining their social activities, names, locations, beliefs, and relationships. Hutton's series documents dimensions of family making, laboring in the informal economy, staking ground, and making a home on the margins, capturing the range of social identities that impoverished white communities in contemporary South Africa represent. This photograph as an artwork provides a powerful frame for my book because of a rare engagement with the genealogy of white feminist anti-racism without any sentimentality or guilt. Further, Hutton's entire oeuvre in this show takes combative and radical stances against racial and sexual violence because of deep familiarity with the process of being marked as a would-be white subject. That is not fully white, not truly legible as someone who should inherit white privilege. Last, Hutton was politicized into taking social documentary photographs by a group of black artists who strove to end apartheid without using visual documentary as a type of spectacle to shock or shame or titillate the white viewing public into some kind of sympathy with the situation in apartheid. In my book, which is in a really different vein, so basically Hutton is really doing the kind of work of history from below. Mine is much more focused on structures and institutions and policies and how they help make people's lives what they end up being. So in a different vein, I retrieve the history of white nationalism, segregationist philanthropy, and global racial politics that repeatedly rediscovers the white poor to suture over racial regimes. And just to be clear, by segregationist philanthropy, I mean philanthropic organizations who are trying to govern, and they believe that the best way to deal with modern societies that are mixed race is to make sure that they're segregationist and enforce a racial hierarchy. And Carnegie in this time period was deeply invested, but so was Ford, so was Rockefeller, all of these foundations, right? And their influence in terms of race politics always produced these similar kinds of things. So my work is concerned with the racial logics associated with rediscovering this community, poor whites, to shore up white nationalisms. Where Hutton's goal was to debunk the explicit snarl in the racial epithet, waste of a white skin, my goal is to understand how it functions to prop up anti-black governance and sociality. So in some ways, what I'm talking about is the poor whites they're central. They are central to making the white minority government. You can't have it just by force. You also have to commandeer a notion of sympathy and white vulnerability, and that's who the poor whites, that's how they function. To do this, I use methods and theories appropriate to race and ethnic politics and political theory, especially critical black political thought, black feminist theories, and black internationalism. While conducting research in South Africa in 1999, archivists queried me, an African American woman, about the origin of my interest in poor whites. They hinted that as an American, I would write a book that othered South African race relations. They told me that since we, meaning Americans, had our own experience of segregation, we should not represent apartheid as exceptional. This reaction was related in part to the history of demonizing and banning African diasporic black activists, Garveyites, missionaries, leftists, black nationalists, and black revolutionaries for mobilizing with their fellow and their comrades, black revolutionaries in Southern Africa and throughout the continent. Black people's history of being movable property, however, can undercut attachments to the possessions, companionship, and belonging entailed in national citizenship. Based on the contingent belonging and kinship that was designed to bring misery under enslavement, this we, that is me being an American, flew apart, especially in periods of racial state-making after apartheid and after enslavement. The archivist who exclaimed at my presence misrecognized me. They misrecognized me as an American. That's the point I'm trying to get to. Further, they sought to instruct me on how to use the privilege of being a U.S. passport holder to become an honorary white and to tell that kind of repeated, plagiarized story over and over again about the engine of history in South Africa. And I didn't come there to tell that story. Should I prove to be a credit to my race and carry the tainted legacy of black radicals antagonistic to anti-blackness and white nationalism, I think the archivist thought I could do some serious damage to white historical consciousness by studying poor white people. I could write a more humanizing account of impoverished white people that attends to the legacies of racial slavery, right? So not just telling a story about why they're poor and how they had been exploited by the British, but I could also link what was happening to poor whites to anti-blackness. But first, in order to write such a history, to conduct such research, I had to claim space as a credible witness to racism and white supremacy in the making of white people within white community relations. To write this more humanizing account of impoverished white people, really deeply shaped by the fact that, upon my first and second reading of the Poor White Study, 5 volumes, what I heard more than anything else was the same kind of national discourse we were having around welfare reform. Very much blaming the poor, very much creating these typologies and caricatures of impoverished, racialized women. And I read it and I thought, boy, this is a really old ideology. So in order to do that, I followed scholars like Jacqueline Bobo and her concept of being a Black female cultural reader, and drew from the main theoretical readings of Black feminists who write about whiteness, like Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spillers, Toni Morrison, Jacqueline Goldsby, Anne Ducille, Joy James, Ange Marie Hancock, and Black internationalists like Cedric Robinson, Pearl Robinson, Cynthia Young, Brenda Gale Plummer, Gerald Horne, Robin Kelly, Michael West, William Martin, Fanon Che Wilkins, Robert Vinson, Brent Hayes Edwards, Tiffany Ruby Patterson, and Black feminist internationalists like Jackie Alexander and Dale Gore, Eric McDuffie, Carol Boyce Davies, and Cheryl Higashida, as well as the scholars in the Stone Center. Why? I felt that these scholars would have a better understanding of how race and class and gender had been produced transnationally and the violence that had been used to sustain them. These scholars have raised sustained critiques of exceptionalist narratives about white nationalism on the grounds that exceptionalist narratives obscure sexualized racial domination and its role in modernity, even for poor whites. Their attention to the complexity of sexualized racial violence, state and interpersonal, embodied and libidinal, more accurately represents a theoretical approach to white poverty. Or as Nicole Alexander Floyd writes, quote, "The illuminating of women of color as political subjects and the gender, race, and sexual politics that impact their lives," end quote, is the work of Black feminist politics. I extend that work by putting Black feminism in conversation with colonial feminism, civilizing missions, and programs of economic development that structure the making of poor whites and their key role in extending anti-Blackness. I had to bring these theories of struggle against racialized sexual violence to bear to explain the power operations and substitutions at work in the naming of poor white people as, quote, a waste of a white skin. The theories of pathology and collateral damage, ethnic purity and white nationalism, and a mythological benign philanthropy that I could never find on the ground in the archives that existed contemporaneously to explain poor whites could do nothing against the nightmares that I experienced after reading the 5-volume Poor White Study by the Carnegie Corporation, with its horrifying white welfare queen rhetoric. The caricatures of poor white people and the risks they are alleged to portend for white supremacy are critical inheritances that enable understanding of what Blackness is supposed to be and how and why anti-Blackness operates as a set of conditions. This language, waste of a white skin, captivated me and forced me to ask what and who were being wasted. What is the categorical waste that whiteness is being compared to? What practices of calling history to account could be brought to bear to tell the story about how poor whites are inextricably bound with Blackness? Well, so one of the things, some answers to these questions include things like poor whites experienced family dissolution once they moved to the urban areas. They were not welcomed by, wealthy white mine-owning companies. Who they were welcomed by was Black and colored and Indian people who were living in the urban areas. The kind of jobs that they actually participated in were diamond dealing and other kinds of, at that time, illicit activities. So they were completely part of the informal economy, and it took almost 10 years for them to actually be incorporated into the mining economy and those urban sectors. So coming back to that inspectorate of white labor, When the Inspectorate of White Labor realized that they had failed to be able to convince business owners to hire on a kind of affirmative action basis poor whites, they started actually giving financial incentives to the large mining companies to hire poor whites. And they hired them in at the exact same job categories that black and colored workers were doing, but they reduced the wages for the black workers and gave a tiny increment of higher wage to the white workers, and changed the job categories so that they could really rigidify the labor market and the racialization of the labor market. Okay. All right. There were other kinds of psychic things that happened, in my reading of the poor white study. I had written my entire dissertation, and the editor looked at it and asked me why there was this phrase, "dem po whites." I literally had been typing "dem po whites." It's embarrassing to admit that, but I had really come to understand that they were a really different kind of racialization, completely without, no kind of trying to be funny, or I just wasn't trying to do that. But all throughout the dissertation, I had been writing that without realizing it. So I had a real kind of affective experience of the racialization of poor whites, because of some of the things I talked about shaped the context of policy making and discussion of racialization of the poor in the United States. That, and also recurring nightmares that I had for about 5 years, actually, about what it meant to be in that kind of destitute situation, right? And have the state try to tell a false story about how you got there. Okay. Afrikaner nationalism as a variant of white nationalism, or a League of Nations for racial imperialism. So I know that focusing on white nationalism turns attention from the social history and distinctive historical uniqueness of the Afrikaner group. It makes the similarities between the political manufacture of Afrikaner nationalism and other forms of settler nationalism perceivable, which is why I turned to white nationalism versus just focusing on the Afrikaner ethnicity. In many ways, the common history of settler colonialism and racial imperialism has been mystified and obscured by attention to white ethnic imagined community. Thus, this redirected focus places Afrikaner nationalism in the context of a larger trend in settler societies that used white ethnic particularity and myths about white autochthony and identity to historicize and naturalize white domination. So the white ethnicity myth, or the notion that Afrikaners were just a white tribe among many African tribes, was a way to kind of claim that, well, they were just competing just like the various African groups, and not to signal that there was a particular kind of will to power over the black population that was different, a particular investment in nation building and racialized nation building. In such narratives of white ethnic imagined community, we are directed toward national origin stories instead of the ways in which such settler origin stories are always historically contingent social formations. Focusing on white nationalism deliberately turns attention away from the exceptionalist race relations history of Afrikanerdom in order to unearth the common history of settler colonialism and racial imperialism championed by white ethnic movements through national origin stories in the United States and South Africa. Now, why is this an important kind of concept? It's really very important for at least two reasons, but many more that I elaborate. But firstly, that the United States was incredibly invested and concerned about who was going to be in power in South Africa. Well, first of all, because they had economic interests, right? So in the 1830s, when South Africans were leaving from Cape Town and from all of the coastal areas and moving into what becomes the Afrikaner republics, or so named Afrikaner republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, they were traveling in Conestoga wagons manufactured in the United States. So people and businesses in the United States had a very long relationship with investment, economic investment, concern about who was going to be in power. But more than that, there was a notion of rulership and who should be the rulers in the world and who should be the ruled. And in this point in time, there is no group that we now think of as people of color that is understood by people of European descent as having the capacity to be part of people who can rule themselves. These are all people that need to be ruled, right? So my focus on white nationalism, it allows me to talk about this kind of international and global context and why places like the United States are actually invested in South Africa, not just for money, but because they want to make sure that this is going to be another enclave, another authoritarian enclave, to use Robert Mickey's language, of white minority rule governance. Y'all with me? Okay, thanks. All right. So the national origin stories of autochthony and Afrikaners just being one of the tribes, right, would suggest that they have all kinds of right to land, and that wherever they landed had no people and no social groups that had any kind of, desires or will to govern or any of that kind of stuff. So these national origin stories were mobilized to legitimate white domination and to suggest that white settlers, particularly in southern Africa, were simply one among many ancient tribes of Africa. This idea conveniently erased not only 20th century histories of racial state-making, but also those that preceded them. Earlier histories of racial state-making that include things like Enlightenment and Christian cartographies of empire relied on the deployment of settler populations to rationalize the world into a proliferation of modern, linked, distinct, white nation states. So, I'll give you kind of a contemporary example. A lot of us are kind of political scientists, especially, are trying to figure out where the Trump phenomena is going to go, right? And for me, this book offers some useful answers and explanations for that, because it's not just that the kind of comments about immigration restriction or in the good old days, we just would have beat up those people, right? And everyone knows in their mind who's hearing those kinds of speeches or reading that on social media who those people are, right? It's not simply that those comments are tapping into rage, they're tapping into notions about who can govern, who should even be allowed to be a part of the process of governing, and who, because of their embodiment and their history, has to be ruled, has to be told how to behave. There's a much deeper kind of thing happening than just, white rage or, white, male rage or white female rage about the economy. It has to do with the way that we believe the making of the nation is happening. Yeah? All right. So considering that the manufacture of white identities coincided with the manufacture of settler colonies as nations, I've been more than suspicious of explanations of Afrikaner identity that's rooted merely in ethnicity. Especially also because in the Poor White Study, one of the things they find when they go around and they interview these, tens of thousands of people, they administer something like 200,000 completely eugenic cognitive tests to children in the country. What they don't talk about while they're doing those kinds of tests is that, not only has there been an enormous amount of pressure and force that compelled poor whites into proletarianization, but this is not a homogeneous social group, poor whites. Many of the people who are designated as poor white are part of the quote-unquote Baster community, a mixed race community. Many of them are part of the colored community. And so there's not any real consensus on who belongs to this category of poor whites. In different parts of the country, they literally are talking about different populations of people. But they do need this kind of boogeyman, right? This specter of a group that is white but is becoming racially degenerate, that's failing to live up to whiteness, that somehow is going to be made into some other kind of creature. This is what the logic of ethnicity actually conceals. So places like the Afrikaner republics, Orange, Free State, and Transvaal, these allegedly Afrikaner spaces, were in fact demographically multilingual, multiracial, multi-ethnic, while being governed by white minority rule. Okay. All right. So I'm going to take a quick moment and talk about some of the concepts. So in the book, I use this concept of white misery, and I use it in a way that's quite different from David Rudiger, who's written a book of that title, short political essays that talk about leisure and suburbanization. So I use it in a little bit different kind of way. White subjectivity invariably includes freedom, selfhood, humanity, desires, forged memory, authority, legitimacy, production, sociality, reproduction, space, and representative. But scholar of white supremacy and anti-blackness Tyrone Woods explains, as a result of freedom, this is a quote, as a result of slavery, the concept of freedom in the West developed through its negation, unfreedom. Becoming white thus requires being rehabilitated for the purposes of becoming the central subject beneficiary of the modern nation and its racial contract. And so something that I work through in the book is, how is it that there's a white population that's not rehabilitatable? And why are they useful to be rediscovered time after time after time? They're useful in this moment in the 1930s. They're also useful again in the 1970s. They're also useful again in the 2000s when an American social documentary photographer, Roger Ballin, travels to South Africa and takes pictures of poor whites who he says he wants to follow because they're tribal like the blacks. And they're these very kind of aestheticizing of the poor. So there's images of adult men in photographs drooling, and images of kind of youngish men with fetal alcohol syndrome, and people who are literally like on their death. It's really spectacular and kind of titillating, really horrifying, quite monstrous images. And I've talked with Ballin about this a lot, and he always says, "Oh, you with your sociological rendering of this. I'm doing aesthetic images, right?" He does admit, though, or concede that he learned about the poor white community having read this poor white study from the Carnegie. So the images get marshaled again and again, particularly at moments of social crisis in the South African racial regime. So concomitant to this status of being subject beneficiary, the white supremacist polity and white nationalist ideologies promise white people that they will achieve historical consciousness in exchange for service as the vigilante paddy rollers of history and as do-gooders of history. White nationalism protects this white subjectivity, and it also provides a political and ideological cover for those, quote, impulses to moral action that have been slain by fears of racial exile. So that is the thought that somehow if you don't join into whiteness, you'll be kicked out, and then you'll be part of that wretched group, that the black group, right? That's the kind of genuine boogeyman in the background. What again I'm arguing in this book is that it never actually relies only on the black group. You also have to have these other groups, right? And particularly poor whites. Therefore, being deemed a waste of a white skin, or what I am theorizing as white flesh or white primitives, this is literally the language that's in the study. The abject status assigned to poor whites typically incites a false equivalency that co-opts and displaces contemporary and historical black suffering and black flourishing for the sake of sympathy, seemingly with poor whites, but is actually sympathy with white supremacy. This notion of the white primitive could not elicit such horror, however, without a history of actual white enslavement somewhere in the recesses of psychic memory, albeit a racial history that is transformed into the empowering nostalgia of ethnicity. When white people are publicly reminded of their own slave heritage, that is, as enslaved persons, the reminders are associated with scare tactics about a threatening black presence and the potential for overwhelming black governance and other expressions of fears of white racial degeneration. Rarely does it talk about, the Dutch or the Belgians or other European groups who actually set up plantations in Europe long before they traveled any place outside of Europe. Such reminders insist, and also the fear of this kind of black boogeyman. These kinds of reminders of the history of enslavement within white communities insist on greater white solidarity. As long as white people anywhere can be injured as collateral damage of anti-blackness, let me read that again. As long as white people anywhere can be injured as collateral damage of anti-blackness, or can be treated like blacks qua slaves, white supremacy has limitless possibilities to criminalize, intervene in, and interrupt black racial resistance, and to minimize and naturalize black racial suffering. This for me is one of the reasons why it's so problematic that blackness is always associated with enslavement. It does a kind of cultural work that we're not always attending to. Unsurprisingly, attention to poverty, gender, miscegenation, ethnicity, religion, or bodily difference of whiteness as occurs in these various rediscoveries and reusings of poor whiteness is often misconstrued as, quote, white disaffiliation from white supremacy, end quote, rather than as a recurring hegemonic configuration of white supremacy. In this project, and what I'm calling white misery is a type of historiographic mischief. The rediscovery of white people as flesh who arrived there through allegedly competition with black people reduced to flesh, as opposed to any other prior power system. Right? White misery as a concept thus allows for a theoretical exploration of the myth that black suffering and black racial resistance are a result of innocent, unfortunate circumstances, socially constructed without agency, decision makers, and beneficiaries. How am I on time?
8 minutes.
About 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
8.
9 minutes?
8.
8 minutes, okay, great. Thank you. I can do that. All right. So I am therefore concerned with when and how white misery returns. For whom and how does white vulnerability suggest a relationship of shared status with blackness? And in what ways was white vulnerability meant to guarantee black suffering as natural and reasonable, while simultaneously rendering black racial resistance as unthinkable? White misery, then, as a concept, suggests that white vulnerability is another alibi for the, quote, neglect and miscomprehension of the nature and genesis of liberation struggles which already had occurred and surely had yet to occur, end quote. All right. So I'm going to skip now to this section on Marie Rothman, and that'll be the last few pages of two. This subheading is called Mothering Poor Whites, the Political Trajectory of Marie Elizabeth Rothman. And that's the woman I was talking about before, the social worker who was one of the research team members. In the book, I look at political cartoons, social documentary photography, government commissions, all of these multiple kinds of ways that poor white identity is talked about, right? The kind of hysteria around it. Both the biography of Marie Elizabeth Rothman, a valorized, extraordinary white South African woman, and the ethnographic vignettes that she recorded constitute a data set about the politics of personal responsibility, which I will now explore. I focus on her biography and the ethnographic vignettes that she related in her volume of the Poor White Study, which was entitled The Mother and Daughter of the Poor Family, to demonstrate how and why attempts to examine white female culpability, innocence, and guilt can be enhanced through attention to earlier historical intraracial practices of inequality. As more historical work has been done on Rothman in the post-apartheid period, even her name has been changed. For example, by 1932 convention to hide the fact that she was a female scholar, they don't actually mention her name. Everyone is mentioned, their first name just has initials, right? But in more recent, feminist scholarship in South Africa, they make sure to really talk about what it meant for her to even have been able to participate in this research project and some of the tensions around that. So while male Afrikaner nationalists claim to be advocates for vulnerable poor whites and hope to garner support via pity and sympathy, their female counterparts trafficked in the disciplinary regime of shame. Rothman's life, though it signals the extraordinary achievements of a female social scientist and political leader in a time when women were actively prevented from rising to their full potential, her, what I call achievement feminism, never really enabled poor women's voices or critiques of the economic system that they lived under. Moreover, Rothman's achievement feminism did not promote destabilization of the gendered class politics of Afrikaner nationalism, which were organized around the white standard of living, domesticity, and upper class aspirations. So something that's, the reason why she has such a focus on women is that the historical imaginary is that most of the people who moved, these poor whites moved from the rural areas, were men. And in fact, it was really daughters. Daughters were moving and were going into these industrial jobs for this first 10 years and sending remittances back home. So they faced some of the same kinds of racialized, sexualized experiences in the workplace that other racialized and sexualized populations of women did. So that included things like sexual assault and violence and having to keep those jobs in order to be able to send remittances home. Rothman was a founding theorist of Afrikaner nationalism and a key figure in the consolidation of a mass movement to secure political, cultural, and social power and status for Afrikaner nationalists. She published children's books and all kinds of books about the life of the traditional pastoral tenant farmers, the Trekboer communities. She published as a journalist and an architect of these key aspects of Afrikaner nationalism. An analysis of her advocacy for poor white women to adopt white standards of living provides an insight into the politics of uplift feminism. It also reveals a depoliticizing of poor white women and, perhaps surprisingly, a practice of reinforcing white poverty. Though upper-class Afrikaner nationalist women may not have been quote-unquote man-made Afrikaner nationalists, meaning people who the men told them what their job for the apartheid ideology would be. She was a more independent forward. She kind of made Afrikaner nationalism herself. She secured her privileged access to leadership and public identities by making sure that among poor white women, they would be demonized and pathologized. Yeah. In addition to her journalism, political fiction, and use of elementary education as a principal venue for the transmission and theorization of Afrikaner nationalism, Rothman was organizing secretary of the ACVV, the Afrikaans Christelijke Vrouwenvereniging, an Afrikaner nationalist women's charity and mutual assistance organization. At this time, her interest in the home life of the Afrikaner family reached its highest point. Rothman's ACVV work consisted of organizing nursing, maternity homes, libraries, rural schools, and training for social workers in rural areas. And I want to reiterate that the part of the reason why she could do this kind of reform era uplift kind of work has to do with the fact that children in Afrikaner families were being taken from their families to go be apprentices and indentured labor for wealthy families. Poor whites who were moving from town to town because they were afraid of their children being taken away from them were regarded by people who were in her position as folks with wanderlust, who were lazy and didn't want to work. And when they were met by a charity organization that found out they had moved more than one time or maybe stolen their children back, often the entire family, or certainly the male of the family, would be forced to go into a forced labor colony, a penal colony, where they would be retaught how to be farmers. Right? They lived in the cities. They weren't going to ever be able to be farmers again. So these were just purely punitive strategies. Rothman's activity and leadership were essential in many Afrikaner nationalist cultural, media, and women's and political organizations. And I would argue that it is appropriate to consider her the female originator of Afrikaner nationalism. She said of herself that her long history of sympathy with poor whites enabled her to discern and offer terms and frameworks for categorizing them. A categorization in which she differentiated between those whose economic failure was the result of individual problems and those whose economic failure was the result of cultural location and geographic isolation. Of the people that she interviewed, she estimated that 27% of poor whites were poor because of, quote, personal defect. And then later in other publications, she said that's, we shouldn't really say that about this population, and yet her own research demonstrates that. Rothman described the problems associated with those whites who failed to become upwardly mobile as, one, laziness, immorality in the household, especially signaled by syphilis rates among mothers, isolation from cultural and uplifting pursuits, wanderlust, and an inability to stay in one place. These are all features of domesticity. Expectations of living too well, and being made into poor whites because they had husbands who had deserted them. She failed to address any of the reasons that families were on the move for real, the kind of structural, institutional, substantive reasons. Men moved from place to place in pursuit of jobs in order to provide for their wives and children. And charity organizations had residency and character reference requirements and also required proof that a person was not trying to, quote, get over on the system. You see how much of this sounds like the welfare reform dialogue? It's haunting, yeah? Like most other commentators, Rothman missed that her charges come informants were long-term outsiders to the economic system. It was obviously quite hard not to be seen as taking advantage and refusing to participate in the sacrificial, self-respecting success that Afrikaner nationalism required of its members. When Rothman commented on immorality in the home, she described women's immorality or the wife having syphilis, but there was no mention of the husband also having had syphilis. In some sense, her understandings of such health crises were confined to the belief that the mother and the wife was the angel in the house, the arbiter of morality and sexual habits of all members of the household. So if the mother and wife was not in that position, she was failing her husband and children. Indeed, if she had married a man with a disease as socially stigmatized in that time period as syphilis, again, she was to blame for choosing a future of racial degeneration. Such a gendering account of the household subordinated women. In the description of the X family, Rothman registers again and again, I just have 2 more minutes, her shock at the unkempt, dirty house where they lived and their visibly unkempt, dirty bodies and clothes. She was repulsed by a story told to her by one woman during an interview about her husband running away to live in a, quote, Kafir village. It's a really horrible racial derogation. Or to get the dirty Kafir women's diseases. Rothman asked her interviewee the following questions. Why had the woman married such a man? Why had her mother permitted her to be involved with such a man? Why did she have an unmarried sister living in the same one-room house with her and that woman's husband? Rothman's series of questions strike me as biased and intentionally avoiding the precarious economic circumstances of her informants. Through her questions, she redirects the cause of poverty to moral culpability. And there's just one last little bit I wanted to do. Okay. So meanwhile, the women that Rothman interviewed often compared themselves to black people, expressing gratitude that at least they were not as wretched as black people. Rothman took this anti-black declaration as a sign that such women had a measure of self-respect and some moral, racial, gender, and class aspirations. Expressing such anti-black sentiments was key to be taken as the sympathetic and striving poor. The interviewee's expressions of racist attitudes and a belief in white supremacy proved to Rothman their adherence to whiteness. However, as Marika Dutoit, the historian, has argued, many of the interviewees and other poor white women who were being interviewed were seeking to supplement their food, clothing, and shelter budgets with tiny amounts of aid from charity organizations. So they were deploying this anti-black Afrikaner nationalist rhetoric as a sign of loyalty in exchange for charity aid, right? I argue, and Dutoit's findings concur, that many of Rothman's interviewees deployed anti-Black rhetoric as the currency of exchange for receiving such aid and advocacy of upper-class social workers. This aid and charitable support function as a small part of a complicated income stream for households and family budgets. This anti-Black sentiment and rhetoric were seen as key to their possibility for rehabilitation and reform. Furthermore, anti-Black sentiment was the one thing that poor white women could deploy to demonstrate their commonality with Rothman and other middle-class social workers, materially, culturally, and socially. But there's a clue that's found in the same interview. The members of the X family were not actually as concerned with measuring up to the standards of whiteness that the poor white study was teaching. And this shows up in a provocative disclosure about a family member who had been convicted for stealing from an African employer. So while Rothman's interviewees were mouthing complaints about certain kinds of work being beneath a white man's dignity, Rothman's assurance that such work was perfect for them as poor whites was missing the joke that the interviewees were playing on her in order to get charity aid. Her interviewees expressed anti-Black views and at the same time pointed to their traffic with, interactions with, and utter dependency on Black people for wages and income. While one could argue that such interview disclosures should be read as poor whites lamenting never being able to be proper white people and being degraded by having to live around and be dependent on Black people, it is also true that these dependencies and interrelationships with Black people, while not properly called solidarities, were certainly as essential to income, food provision, housing, employment, and household income as the highly scripted and regulated attempts to gain support from middle-class whites. I'm actually going to stop there. Yeah. So thank you. I'm sure there's some questions or feedback. It's kind of an abrupt place to stop. So go ahead and stop. Do people have residences or thoughts about how this connects? Sure.
Thank you very much. This
Thanks.
is a great presentation. I could do, especially with gender dimension. So I'm sure our class at least learned a lot.
Thank you.
One question that I want to have, and we were talking in the class as part of a conversation, that if we start from, let's say, Salvation Army moment, and they have very similar philanthropy,
That's
they're very
right.
embarrassed about
That's right.
white prostitutes in India.
That's right.
And all the way, as beautifully show, South Africa becoming very important in the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's not about identity, that Carnegie Corporation actually contributes to the creation of this empire.
Mm-hmm.
Where does your story end? When is Carnegie Corporation is not embarrassed of South Africa? So how does that happen? How does that transition to end?
So what I'm understanding your question is, where does Carnegie's influence end, or where
Also,
does
South Africa is seen as an exception.
Yeah.
Britain and America, they all globally contribute to this whiteness.
Right.
And apartheid. And our class familiar with Jan Smuts and
Yes.
how Nehru blames him as doing Hitlerism, although
Right.
In the 30s it's kind of normal, everybody does the same thing.
Yes.
When, do you know, when is that South Africa began to be seen as exceptionally bad?
Well, it's okay. So it's seen as exceptionally bad as a late developer before it becomes exceptionally bad as in terms of whiteness, right? So even quite early on, there's an American novelist, and I can't call her name right now, but I have a really extended discussion of her right now. She writes a novel called The Fiddler. Anyway, she's one of these people who, picking up on the language of South Africa being a late developer, in that kind of language, she has all of these novels that describe kind of the heinousness of South African racial politics. So really, South Africa is backward compared to its sister republics on every index possible. Even though it's so important financially to the global economy that's burgeoning, very quickly from 1880s onward, it kind of like leaps on the scene and becomes really, really significant. But I read that backwardness, that exceptional kind of like, this is really terrible. It's part of the way that South Africa functions in the global imaginary of whiteness. And it takes a lot of it diminishes the consequences of racialization in New Zealand or Fiji or Australia or the United States. And so it becomes the kind of whipping boy in a way around its racial politics. But its racial politics are not unlinked from or different. And this is really clear. The method that I use of looking at the movement of philanthropists across and the movement of social scientists across all of these spaces is the same as the movement of, Welsh miners who would, mine during the gold rush in California and then end up mining in South Africa or Australia or New Zealand, right? And those Welsh miners, when they celebrated Independence Day, July 4th, they would do things like burn down the Chinatown in whatever country that they were in, right? So there's a continuity of, anti-people of color racialization that's happening. But South Africa always stands as this place that just is not with it, right? So I view their racialization in that longer history. Sure, thanks for the question. Sure, hi. Thank you for your attention, all of you. Thank you. It's dense, it's very theoretical.
Thank you. You mentioned that oftentimes the term poor whites would represent people of varying ethnicities and racial compositions.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on how that came to be.
Yeah. Well, part of the way that it came to be is that the Great Trek was never, so that 1830s movement and 1860s movement where supposedly South African historians have said the Afrikaner community, fed up with British Empire, moved to the hinterland to get away. They realized they couldn't fight the British anymore. They just are going to move away and establish their own independent, authoritarian enclaves, again, to use Mickey's language, right? Robert Mickey's political historian's language. And they take their slaves with them. Right? So everybody who had been working for them. So these Afrikaner republics are never white. They are white minority rule authoritarian enclaves, but they're never white. They're never white. So the social and racial labor hierarchy that, obtained in Cape Town, they go and they take it right with them to all of the other places that they land, all of those small towns. And so that's part of the reason as to why this population can't really be called white, either phenotypically or socially. That's not, or certainly not linguistically. It doesn't hold, right? But what you do see is this intense focus on manufacturing of whiteness. So one of the researchers who participated in this held and hosted some of the first language or quote unquote tall festivals, the word in Afrikaans for language, tall festivals. Because for the most part, this community of, quote unquote Afrikaners that moved was bilingual up until almost the 1940s. And one of these researchers held the first tall festivals where people were supposed to really only speak Afrikaans, and was the person who lobbied at Willowmore for the founding of the first Afrikaans only medium high school. When in fact, when you went to high school, as somebody living in these Afrikaner republics, up until this 1930s moment, you would have been taught Dutch and English and probably another language, right? Yeah. Hi.
Yeah,
Dr.
can you
Bird.
say, you don't say much about the other sort of comprador classes that are there and their relationship.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
I'm sorry, I thought I was projecting. You didn't say much about the other people of color, Malaysian, Asian Indians, and how they contributed to something that may not have just been black and white, but you had this comprador set that are there who also may have amassed some wealth. So how do they interfere or in that sort of notion of whiteness and then having a poor white element as well?
I don't actually, because the histories are still really, they're really quite distinctive, right? So in order to write about the colored community, you'd have to start with a long history of the African People's Organization and really master this entire historiography of the colored community. Similarly, with the Indian community, you have to master an entire historiography. So what I do in the book is when there's moments in the archives where I found where they're talking about, black and colored people or black and Indian people, I kind of have a string of kind of black and other folks. But I don't actually in this book really wrestle with each of the how racialization happens for these other communities and how they react to poor whites. I don't really do that at all. Yeah, but I appreciate the question. I have begun work on my second book. So one chapter of it's been published as a journal article, and it's on kind of unconventional roots of Black feminism in South Africa. And so the first chapter looks at women's assemblies that people carry with them from the rural areas through their transition to township living and urban living. And the second chapter is on Fatima Meer. Fatima Meer is an important activist, sociologist who did work with impoverished communities, the Indian and African community in Durban. And so I am now beginning to amass my history of the Indian community in South Africa. But because the history was so driven by accounts of English versus Afrikaner, even trying to land on historiography that focused on Black people was really very, very challenging. So in the next book, in that second chapter, would be the right place to look at how I talk about how the Indian population in particular modulates and responds to and contributes to the making of poor whites, or how they are impacted by the uses of poor whites. Yeah. Any comments from any of the young researchers in the room? Yeah. I'm always curious how people who are kind of just starting out in their academic careers, how this kind of work lands. Does it remind you of anything, or sure?
I was just thinking about this, and I'm not sure if you answered it already, but when blaming being poor on the poor whites, is it just their relation to people of color, or especially Black people, that is like the reason they are poor? Or is it like, are there like other ways that they like blame them other than like the systemic?
Yeah. Part of it is geographical proximity and economic dependence on non-European people, to use that kind of shorthand language. But it's also this sensibility that they haven't internalized the norms of middle-class bourgeois life and are not interested in or reject the norms of kind of settlement in a town, in a house. The other place where I came across this title, Waste of a White Skin, was from a novelist who wrote the novel Triumph. And she describes a family in the run-up to transition, so like in the late 80s and the 90s. And it's a lovely kind of rendering of the story of poor whites, right? Because these are people who have been hearing all the political rhetoric from the kind of fascist white front, white power organizations that are saying, if Mandela comes to power, everything is going to be terrible in the society. We'll never, no one will ever be able to have anything. Really apocalyptic, dystopian kind of political rhetoric and campaigning that's happening. And so she describes a family, a poor white family, that there's one woman in the family, Molly, and she has a companion animal, a dog, and that's really the only person that she has any kind of real communication with in the household. And she is constantly, she's a narrator, and she's telling the story about everyone in the household. There's a guy called Treppy, who's her brother, and then there's a guy called Pop, who's her father, and then there's an adult child who's really mentally incapacitated, but is often very violent in the household. And it comes out later that it's not clear whether she bore that adult child with her father or with her brother. And so it's this kind of like story about what Afrikaner nationalism has done to the poor white community. And so these motifs around incest and circle the logger and keep the secrets within the group is kind of showing up. And she has characters that come and knock on their door every week, and their sole purpose, these are party officials, they're Afrikaner nationalist party officials, to come and kind of give them a script about what it means to be white and how great it is to be white. And I love the novel because, differently than an account that's historical or theoretical or social scientific, it's much more like this image, this kind of photographic image. There's so much going on in there. And I tend to find, like following after Avery Gordon, that the cultural production really gets you closer to the meanings of a social formation or social identity than what we can say as social scientists, right? Because that's where it's really messy, and you really get to see how, what a puzzle it actually is to live within this existence. So there's religious, and there's social and moral and ethical and economic reasons that these people get designated as poor white over and over and over again. Yeah, but definitely the proximity to blackness is part of it. So, the brother in that household, Treppy, he's the most vocal in terms of his, hating black people, and he's kind of saying that all the time throughout the novel. And the irony is that he's the only person who actually has a friend outside the family, and his friend is a black Rastafarian that he meets at the trash dump every day, and they have conversations and kind of debates about how the society is going to be after apartheid. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I appreciate your bravery. Yeah.
All right, if there are no more questions, then we will end it here, and thank Tiffany very much for coming in and for the very enlightening discussion. The books are available for purchase. You can pick it up here, and she'll sign it for you, and you can pay it on your way out at the counter.
Thank you all
so
very
much.
much.
Can I see the presentation?
Yeah, sure.